All right, hello. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming in person and online. And also thank you so much, Dean Alhori and our sponsors, Tecnoglass and AIA Miami, for supporting this lecture series. Just one quick logistical note before we start. Please email Shauna Meyer to receive your AIA continuing education credits if you need it. My name is Lily Wong. I'm the newish assistant professor at the School of Architecture. I'm organizing this semester's lecture series. This series explores how designing for and with plans can shape alternative ways of designing and building, assumptions and knowledge about architecture, as well as the act of planting as a form of empowerment. So before I introduce tonight's speaker, I would like to just say a few words about tonight's format. So Marc will give a talk for 30 to 35 minutes, followed by a conversation with Dean Alhori and Professor Vita Pivo. So Dean Alhori, of course, doesn't really need an introduction, but if I may just say 2 sentences, he's trained as a scholar focusing on 19th century European architecture. And he also practiced as a principal at Horry Livet Farm. So spoiler alert. So for the next lecture, the dean is going to share some of his previous work about using living organisms as a part of a building component. So come back in a few weeks. And Professor Pivo is a historian focusing on material life cycles, construction labor, ordinary landscapes, and climate change. Her forthcoming book is called Cast in Concrete, How the US Built Its Empire. So tonight, I am honored to welcome Marc Tsurumaki to Miami for his lecture. He's going to talk more about plants as building material. Marc is a principal at LTL Architects, a firm in New York that he started with David Lewis and Paul Lewis in 1997. They have completed a range of ground-up buildings, renovations, and speculative research. So I'm sure most of you have seen the work of LTL. Well, if not, I will make sure you do. Their recently completed projects include a residence at the Carnegie Mellon University, a poster museum in New York, and an early childhood center in Arkansas. Recently, LTL has refocused its practice on the role of embodied carbon and the architectural potentials of plants and earth-based materials and reuse. Their book, Manual of Biogenic House Sections, published in 2022, explicates the tectonic and spatial opportunities of biogenic and geogenic buildings. And I will leave it to Marc to explain what those 2 words mean. Another earlier book by them, Manual of Section, which includes section drawings of notable buildings around the globe, has become an important instructional tool in architecture schools internationally and has been translated to 6 different languages. LTL Architects are the recipients of the National Design Award from the Cooper Hewitt. They were named the Firm of the Year by AIA New York State in 2019 and have been inducted into the ID Hall of Fame. Their work is in the permanent collections of the Museum of Modern Art, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, and also the Carnegie Museum of Art. Marc Tsurumaki is also a professor of practice at Columbia and also the president of the Storefront for Art and Architecture in New York. So on behalf of the school, thank you very much, Marc, for coming to share your work and research with us tonight. Please join me and welcome Marc Tsurumaki.
Okay, is this working? Great. Okay, thank you, Lily. Thank you, Rodolphe. Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. I'm very happy to be here as part of this lecture series I'll be presenting, as Lily was mentioning, some of our recent work, but really sort of focusing relative to the topic of the question of the integration of plants in relation to architecture, about a recent publication that we put out roughly 2 years ago called the Manual of Biogenic House Sections. LTL as a practice really engages in a kind of number of diverse facets. We really think of built work, speculative work, and kind of research as reciprocal components of our studio, and like to think that each of these components informs one another. The publications have taken, I would say in the last decade or so, the form of what we like to call manuals. We like this term of manual because it's reference to questions of utility or just usefulness, and we really think of these publications as tools for the discipline, for students of architecture. The first of these was the Manual of Section that was mentioned earlier, published in 2016. It's been translated into a number of different languages. We think 5, 6, we're not sure. We're told there's a Turkish version, but we haven't seen it yet. So if you see a copy when you're in Turkey, give us a ring and take a picture of it. The book operates through a series of 64 detailed sectional perspectives that basically investigate section as a site of invention and a space of resistance to the kind of ruthless economic logics of contemporary modes of architectural production. I'm not going to get into all of that tonight, but I think really since that book was published, we have been, like many people, increasingly concerned about the existential urgency of climate change and its relationship to architecture, with the legacies of extractivism and the material exploitation of landscapes, and the devastating impacts of these practices on humans, on non-humans, and on the planet. And so in 2022, we came out with this publication after about 4 years or 5 years of research. In many ways, I think we think of this as the more important book. And as was alluded to, it sort of aligns with the moment in our own practice where we're kind of opening up these questions of how we build, and more specifically, what we build with in a moment of ecological crisis. So the book is divided into 9 material chapters and a chapter on reuse. This notion of reuse is incredibly important in relationship to addressing notions of embodied carbon. And although I won't talk about them tonight, our office has been involved really throughout the course of our history with projects that engage reuse at a diversity of scales, from the infrastructural scale of renovating Steeplechase Pier in Coney Island in the wake of Hurricane Sandy, to the renovation of a kind of recently opened museum in New York that reutilizes a 19th century industrial building, to this project for art museum in Austin, Texas, that repurposes a turn-of-the-century theater turned department store. Many of these projects, while capitalizing on the logics of reuse, are also dealing with questions of operational carbon, that is with the energetic and thermal performance of buildings. That's really been the kind of primary kind of preoccupation of architects over the course of the last couple of decades. So there's been a lot of focus on how to make our buildings work better, to work more efficiently, to work with a higher degree of, let's say, kind of operational efficiency. But what we've been really thinking about recently is this kind of question of the role of materiality and embodied carbon, and maybe I'll just go through this very quickly. You've probably seen graphs like this one. This is sort of laying out the trajectory of global greenhouse gas emissions relative to annual outputs of carbon. So the black line is kind of where we are. The big gray swaths are where we're going if we don't actually make any changes. But the sort of frightening reality is that this is actually where we need to be. Oops, sorry, too far. Which is a 65% reduction in CO2 by 2050 and net zero by 2050, if we're actually have any chance of staying within the IPCC recommended limits of 1.5 degrees Celsius change in global temperature that would allow us to avoid the most catastrophic impacts of climate change. We're, of course, already failing to do this fairly remarkably, but we think that this is not a reason to give up, but in fact, motivation to address this even more urgently in our work. So This is also a diagram that we made that is generally speaking kind of common knowledge, this idea that buildings are a large part of this problem. So buildings are about 40% of global carbon emissions, and this is typically divided into operational and embodied carbon. Just quickly, I'll define those terms. Operational carbon is the carbon associated with the energy generation that we utilize to operate, maintain, electrify, and occupy our buildings. Embodied carbon is the carbon that's associated with the construction of our buildings in the first place, right? So the carbon associated with the processing, extraction, fabrication of materials and their assembly into the form of building. So 11% may not seem that big of a deal, but if we actually look at new global construction over the course of the next 30 years, embodied carbon actually becomes about half of that. And if we actually look at the increasing performance of buildings, the fact that buildings are getting better and better at conserving energy, embodied carbon becomes more than half, about 56% of that equation. The other aspect of embodied carbon is that it's what we could call upfront carbon, meaning that it's already expended at the time that the building comes into existence, whereas operational carbon accrues over the lifespan of the building. So the returns on operational carbon take longer to get to. And if we're really thinking about these urgent kind of timeframes that we need to act within in order to actually address the kind of urgency of the climate question, we really need to be thinking about, we would argue, embodied carbon. So what can we do? Again, as we said, we can reuse, we can build less, but in fact, likely to reuse out of this situation. So if we look at predictions over the course of the next 30 years, we're going to be adding about 2.5 trillion square feet of new buildings to the planet. So that's roughly doubling the amount of architecture on the surface of the world in the next 3 decades. Given that sort of enormous increase in production, which probably sounds like good news to architects, but kind of really increases the kind of importance of really thinking about this notion of how do we build in a moment of this kind of import of this sort of juncture, and how do we think about materials not only in terms of their durability, their maintenance, their structural performance, but in terms of their embodied carbon. And this is a chart that we produced for the book. So at the top of this chart, those guys over there are industrially processed material, metals, and concrete. And by the way, that page is just there, but they go way, way, way over here onto the adjacent wall surface. The materials towards the bottom, the kind of carbon sequestering materials are generally speaking biogenic and geogenic materials, meaning materials that are either derived from plants or from earth-based substances. So what we think all of this means is that we really need to reassess the legacy of modernism and its reliance on concrete, steel, and glass, which are not only 3 of the most carbon-intensive materials, but are based on extractive processes that have devastating impacts on ecosystems and landscapes, as well as inequitably distributed effects on communities and human health. There is an alternative, and there are many ways of addressing this problem, which I won't talk about because there's not enough time. But we think one of the really important ones is to build materials that are either low carbon or, as in the case of plants, that actually sequester carbon within their very cell structure. So the good news is that we have these materials. They're already here. We don't need to invent them. We don't need to research them. Well, we need to research them, but we don't need to kind of create a new thing. They're ubiquitous, they're globally distributed, they're broadly inexpensive, and by and large, we actually already know how to build with them. Well, why is that? Because, of course, I'm talking about these things as if they're new and revolutionary, but in fact, these are, of course, the oldest materials that we've built with throughout human history. And so it's incredibly important to draw upon indigenous knowledge, on vernacular practices, and to think about the kind of cultural traditions associated with building with plant and earth-based materials over time. However, we're also, as architects and as contemporary architects, really interested in this question of how do we build with these materials now in the 21st century? How do we think about them in an innovative way? And what are their impacts on, in this case, in the context of the book, new forms of domesticity? So the book engages 55 houses from around the world. And so we might start with this question of why the house? Like, why are we looking at houses to begin with? And this is sort of a a bit of an anxiety-provoking question for us because one could argue that single-family houses are part of the problem. We build too many of them, over 1 million a year in North America alone. Our houses are generally too big. They've gone from about 1,000 square feet in 1950 to over double that in 2020. And by and large, we actually, with the exception of the frame that's fairly ubiquitous for American single-family residential construction, they're built primarily out of petrochemically derived products that are toxic, environmentally destructive, and high in embodied carbon. These materials are based on essentially a kind of extension of the petrochemical industry, a take, make, trash linear cycle, which means that at the end of the day, most of them end up in the landfill and continue to kind of pollute and degrade our ecosystem. If we take a closer look at the construction of the house, we can get a sense of part of the reasons that this is true, which is that if we think about how we build walls today, we tend to build walls out of lightweight, thin, single-performing hygienic layers, which are based on a strict division between inside and outside. These materials are often working at cross purposes to one another, so inducing issues of mold, of toxicity, of kind of contradictory building performance operations. They're also extremely hard to pull apart and reutilize at the end of life. By contrast, biogenic and geogenic systems tend towards thickness and towards limited material components, often integrating multiple functions in a single monolithic mass, becoming simultaneously structure and skin, insulation and envelope, a kind of symbiotic assembly in which the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So in the book, we look at, again, 55 houses from around the world. These are all, generally speaking, relatively small houses, comparatively inexpensive, drawn from different cultural, climatic, and geographic contexts. And the idea in each of these cases is to think about how in each instance, the engagement with the specifics of the material provokes an architectural response in the house, right? Provokes a kind of spatial and tectonic response in the actual design. As I mentioned before, the book is divided into 9 material chapters. In each of these chapters, we identify the approximate carbon sequestering capacity of the material. We map each material's life cycle from field to form and back again, kind of repositioning the building as a kind of isolated artifact, not as an isolated artifact, sorry, but as a temporary accumulation of matter and energy that has a kind of origin and afterlife, right? So we tend as architects to only think about this kind of, 12 o'clock to 4 o'clock part of the cycle. How do we kind of put materials together into the form of a building? But the reality is that those materials come from somewhere. They have to go somewhere after the end of life of the building, and the building really only exists for a kind of limited point in time. So we have to think about this entire logic of how the things that we build with are linked to a whole circuit of material flows that are ultimately bound to kind of natural systems. We map the transformation of the material from the original plant, in these cases, to the building component. This is really important because it's the transformation of the material that actually constitutes the kind of carbon element of the material, right? It's the industrial processing that produces the kind of carbon of the building component. Then we look in each cases of these houses, photographs, axonometric drawings that explode each of the dwellings, then detailed cross-sectional perspectives that allow for an understanding of the ways in which these material systems catalyze kind of architectural response within each of the projects within the book. So I'll go through a few of these material conditions very rapidly. I'm not going to talk a lot about mass timber because it's probably something you all have heard a fair amount about. It's kind of the poster child for biogenic materials. And obviously it has a kind of amazing kind of capacity to sequester carbon relative to materials like concrete and steel. However, it's complex, right? Once we start thinking about mass timber, we're talking about trees. Trees are obviously very long-lived organisms. The trees that we utilize for construction take about 30 to 100 years to mature. cultivating trees, logging releases carbon into the atmosphere, and only about 50% of any given tree is actually converted into usable building material. So there are issues, right? When we're thinking about timbers that have to do with the management of forests, with deforestation, with monocultures that develop in relationship to the production of mass timber. So it's a complex question. But obviously, incredibly useful product. I won't get into depth, but made from kind of cross-laminating basically lumber elements in a kind of laterally kind of perpendicular pattern into sequential layers so that they create these large-scale structural planks. The idea of these planks then changes the ways that we can think about building with them. So just a couple of very quick examples. Jennifer Bonner's house gables, where these very large-scale CLT elements are used to create the kind of complex internal geometry of the roofs, creating a sort of internal topography and allowing for rapid assembly on site due to the CNC milling and prefabrication of the panels. Project by Atelier Satsama called the Meteorite House, that actually is comprised of 2 layers of CLT construction, a series of CLT boxes, rectilinear boxes that constitute the living spaces of the house, arrayed within a more kind of geomorphic outer shell. In between, that kind of thick zone in between is really an air gap that allows for the kind of thermal insulation of the house. So this is a house that's literally all CLT. There's no other insulation except for the air on the exterior, and the outer layers of CLT are coated with an exterior varnish for weatherproofing. So I'm going to go through these quickly, I said. So, so we're still in the realm of trees, but cork is a really fascinating material. It's of course the bark of the cork oak tree. And cork has kind of astonishing kind of material qualities. It's water resistant, fungally resistant, rot resistant. It has thermal properties, acoustical properties, and even structural properties. The limitations when we talk about cork are really that it only grows natively in a very specific region of the world, the Iberian Peninsula and other places around the Mediterranean. And its processing is dependent upon sort of centuries-old skilled labor practices, where the bark is carefully culled from the tree every roughly 7 to 14 years over the lifespan of these trees, which are very long-lived, over 200 years in some cases. These methods have developed over long periods of time so that the underlying organism is not hurt. So it's essentially kind of like shearing sheep. The tree continues to live, and the cork goes primarily, believe it or not, almost entirely into the production of wine corks. So kind of billions of wine corks are produced every year, and almost all of the cork that we use in the construction industry and architecture is actually made from the reground residue of the wine cork production itself. So those are granulated, they're ground up, and then they're recomposited either using additives or preferably through autoclaving, which activates the naturally occurring resins within the cork to bind to itself. Okay, so quickly, really imaginative house with the unimaginative name of Cork House. In England, that's actually comprised almost entirely of cork. So here the building is really built of almost a kind of organic or vegetal masonry. So thermally autoclaved cork blocks that are then CNC milled into specific shapes. And as you can see in the section, there's nothing else, right? The wall section is just cork. There's no insulation, finish, layers, structure. It's just cork laid up on itself and then formed into these corbelled beehive-like arches that move into a series of skylights at the top, defining a series of rooms below. Okay, so now we're moving away from the realm of trees into the realm of grasses. So bamboo is not a tree, it's an arborescent woody grass. It's also among the fastest growing plants in the world. And this is what's sort of critical to think about when we're talking about plants as a building material and their kind of regenerative and carbon sequestering capacity, which is how fast do they grow, right? So when we're thinking about bamboo, we're now talking about not decades to grow a tree, but literally years, 3 to 7 years for most of the species of bamboo that are harvested for construction purposes. bamboo is also harvested from a rhizomatic root system without, again, killing the underlying organism. So when we harvest bamboo, we're not killing the plant, we're simply kind of culling part of it, which can then be allowed to regrow. Most of the bamboo that we use in construction is kind of crushed, split, and then re-aggregated into sheet goods like flooring and wall panels. But for most of the projects in the book, we were really interested in buildings that actually used the full culm, which is the kind of stalk of the bamboo, which has enormous structural capacity in terms of flexibility and strength, particularly when it's bundled together into different assemblies to create larger beams and columns. So this is a house in Ecuador, a place, again, using native local bamboo that essentially constructs a house almost as a kind of occupiable bamboo scaffolding, which uses a series of inclined planes that produce both the circulation of the house, but also the living surfaces within. And here, even the limited amount of concrete, which is lightened with rice husk, is poured into half culms of bamboo as a kind of living or kind of permanent formwork. A project in Baoxi, China, by Anna Heringer, a German architect, for a youth hostel, where sort of netting of bamboo, which is actually drawn from local techniques and cultural traditions of basket weaving, so splitting and bending the bamboo into this kind of woven structure, which wraps a kind of earthen core, which is the kind of heating element of the project, and then sleeping pods are cantilevered into the interstitial space in between the two. Okay, so the last two materials that I'm going to talk about are both essentially agricultural products. And we're also now moving into the realm of insulation. I know that's all what you came to architecture school to study, insulation, right? It's the kind of super sexy part of architecture. But insulation is incredibly important, right? In our buildings, how do we actually allow them to perform better without necessarily inducing a lot more toxic materiality or kind of carbon in the construction of the building? So hemp bears a resemblance to another plant that you might be somewhat more familiar with. And in fact, for many years, it was illegal to grow hemp in this country because of its resemblance to cannabis, because of the so-called war on drugs, and actually only became legal to grow hemp again recently. But hemp, again, is incredibly productive as a plant. It can be planted in degraded soil. It actually regenerates ecosystems locally. It regenerates soil. It can be grown with very little water, minimal pesticides, no kind of added fertilizers, et cetera. And it kind of can be cultivated actually in most places twice within a normal growing cycle of another plant. So super productive, super useful. Historically, it's been used for everything from fabric to medication. And the part that we use for architecture is what's called the hurd. So basically, the stalk of the hemp plant is broken down, the hurd is extracted, then it's combined with equal parts lime and water to make what's called hemp lime, sometimes inaccurately called hempcrete, which suggests it has a kind of a concrete-like structural capacity, which it doesn't. It's rigid and it performs hygroscopically, it absorbs toxins, and it's an extraordinarily good thermal insulator, but it's not truly structural in that sense. It's usually blown into framed walls, compacted into cavities, or it can be formed into blocks and kind of stacked up to form kind of partitions. Okay, so this is the last material that I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to segue a little bit into some of our own design work. And this is the material that we've become really kind of fascinated with at the end of a lot of this research. And one of the reasons that we think straw is so important as a potential building material is that it's actually waste material, right? So straw, which is not to be confused with hay, which is a feedstock for animals. Straw is simply what's left over once you cultivate a grain crop. So rice, wheat, oats, barley, rye, what have you. Once we kind of cultivate it, what's left over is straw. Most of that straw has very little use. It's used for animal bedding, ground cover, but most of it, or large portions of it, are actually left to biodegrade within the fields of the world. Basically, wherever you grow grain crops for food, which is everywhere, right, you have straw. And according to one calculation, the amount of straw that is basically left to rot in agricultural fields worldwide is equal in carbon sequestering potential to the total annual global production of concrete, right? So if we could sequester that carbon, we could essentially offset the kind of carbon impact of concrete kind of globally. Again, the ways in which the straw has traditionally been built with is through straw bale construction. This is probably the most widely known. Basically, different scales of straw bale, which is really an agricultural mechanism for storing straw, can be essentially piled up, again, kind of like large-scale building blocks into load-bearing walls. This has been happening for hundreds of years. There are over 100-year-old straw bale buildings in places like Nebraska. Typically, that's coated with plaster, frequently earthen plaster on the outside, which aids its structural capacity. There are many more contemporary systems that are either using straw bales within prefabricated cassettes or compacting them into other forms of timber construction as a kind of primarily as an insulated material. But we think it is really amazing about straw is that it has both a structural capacity and a thermal capacity. So this idea of structural insulation is something that we think has a lot of kind of beneficial potential. I'm not going to talk about it here, but another related material, it's not really the same thing, but thatch, which has a long history, but has also seen kind of increased readaptation in a contemporary format. So these are a series of drawings that we did over the course of last summer, looking at thatch in buildings from thousands of year tradition of Ise Shrine to contemporary buildings like the Henning Larsen Sundby School, which was built just last year in Denmark. So really the idea of thatch is it's typically a waterproofing or roofing material, and it's an exterior product. Unlike straw, it's typically made with reeds, although in some places straw is also but moving back to straw, this is a project from the book by an architect named Atelier Schmidt, Werner Schmidt, called the Gambit House. And essentially, as you can see, this project uses massive, what are called jumbo straw bales, essentially piling them up to make these massive, thick walls. They're then kind of corbelled into this kind of pyramidal shape at the top of the building, a skylight. This is actually the most carbon sequestering project in the entire book, simply because of the massive amount of straw utilized, about 75 metric tons of agricultural waste. And by the way, we did kind of carbon calculations, which is a complex topic that I won't get into here, but this was by far the most carbon sequestering of all of them, simply because of the massive quantities of the material that were kind of utilized. And so just to segue quickly, and I'll be finishing up here in a few minutes, but to talk about some of our own work, kind of following on the research of the book. So after about 4 or 5 years of working on the book, we obviously became kind of really interested in exploring the implications of these materials within our own design processes. And we became really kind of interested in the varying kind of capacities of the materials, how they could operate together. So we designed a series of 5 biogenic houses. I'm going to talk about them only sort of briefly here, but these were generally based on hybridizations between different systems. So looking at how the kind of weaknesses and strengths of different biogenic and geogenic systems can be kind of blended together or hybridized to create kind of positive effects. So a CLT A-frame house that essentially utilizes the unmilled 10 by 50 foot CLT blank, which is the kind of standard modular size of the CLT panel. Typically, because the milling is associated with additional energy and production time, the idea here was to use it as a very large scale tilt-up panel that could create a kind of a sort of integrated contemporary A-frame cabin, series of sleeping platforms projected out into the kind of echeloning space of this triangular form. Lamella Earth House that essentially shelters an earth-based dwelling within a large greenhouse constructed out of modular bamboo elements that are comprised into a large-scale arch that creates a passively conditioned interstitial space that acts as both kind of environmental buffer for the house, kind of interstitial thermal layer that mediates the climate, but also acts as a productive garden for the inhabitants. And then finally, we designed 2 houses that were really based on this idea of straw as thickness. And what really kind of fascinated us here was the idea that if we're thinking about a material that's plentiful, cheap, that's kind of everywhere, and that the more we use of it, the more carbon we sequester and the more thermal and structural benefit that we get, then the whole kind of sort of modernist paradigm of optimization basically gets inverted, right? So for over 100 years, we've been trying to use less and less material to do kind of more and more things, right? To perform highly, we have now extremely thin buildings that we have to then thermally condition and augment in different ways. So the idea here was, could we think about thickness, right? Which is something that's in a way been exorcised from modernism, right? From modernist ways of thinking about space as a kind of positive generator for the architectural form. The two houses are both based on stacking up jumbo straw bales. So again, these very large scale agricultural modules. The first is a very simple hollow cube of stacked straw bales in a series of CLT prefabricated modules. The straw bales support the CLT modules, and the modules stabilize the straw bale assembly. They're arranged in a continuous spiraling circulatory pattern linked by a staircase that moves front door to roof deck, and each of the prefabricated CLT modules comprises one of the programmatic spaces of the house. Each one also becomes a kind of occupiable window that perforates the thick surface or a kind of mass of the walls of the house to create a space that's ultimately both thick and massive and permeable at the same time. The second of these houses is based on two differential methods of stacking up jumbo straw bales. So a corbelled wall and then a kind of terraced landscape. Those two elements are tied together by a series of structural timber box beams that span between them and are kind of filled with additional straw. Those are capped by a sacrificial layer of straw that allows for the house to essentially kind of biodegrade into the surrounding landscape. The interior is captured, the primary spaces of the house are captured between those two elements, creating this sort of stepped, kind of terraced interior logic, a kind of domestic, a sort of domestic interior landscape. Whereas the private space of the house, the bedrooms and bathrooms are burrowed back into this kind of massive thickness of carbon sequestering straw that insulates the living spaces of the house from the kind of surrounding environment, and creates these kind of exchanges between skylights, interior spaces, the kind of ecosystem of the site, and the kind of occupiable spaces of the house itself. So in this case, right, this idea that thickness, which is frequently conceived in negative terms, here really is kind of optimized for thermal and structural benefits. So in this case, in a sense, the excessive becomes efficient. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up here with just a couple of quick final projects. We've also been doing, in addition to design work, a series of material experiments. As I mentioned, there are a number of companies that are now working, and fabricators that are working with prefabricated compressed straw panels that are basically can be used to build small-scale constructions fairly rapidly. We were really interested in sort of looking at how does this work? How do we do it? Can we do it ourselves? So we built this kind of crazy machine that kind of compresses straw. We operated and experimented with different binders. This is actually mycelium. So once we compress the straw, which is what gives it its thermal and structural capacity, you then have to hold it together. So we worked with different materials, mycelium in this case, lime, cement, wood glue, like everything we could find, lime, earth, different composites. We also put these elements in what's called an instron machine, which is basically what we use to test the structural capacity of materials. And what you see is like, it's just really weird, right? This behaves very differently than any normative material. So if you put a chunk of concrete in here, it will basically resist, and then at some point it'll catastrophically fail, right? So what the straw does, it sort of keeps squishing down, and then it kind of bounces back. So you have a kind of squishy material that operates in a very different way than kind of ordinary structural materials do. Two final projects very quickly. So this is one that's very much in process. We're working a new product that's being developed for compressed straw boards, which actually use a thermal process to kind of compress and bind the straw to itself using, again, naturally occurring binders within the material. Instead of basically using this as a planar wall surface, we're looking at stacking it up to create a kind of thickened thermal envelope, but also kind of testing its kind of structural capacity in the form of a kind of modular prefabricated dwelling that we're planning on constructing this summer. We also became really fascinated with some of you may have seen these, the sort of ubiquitous feature of the American agricultural landscape, right? These jumbo circular straw bales, which we see everywhere, and the idea that these could actually become a form of, let's say, kind of occupiable structure or a kind of spatial thickness, kind of working with it as a kind of organic poche that could be modulated in different ways, a kind of new form of hypostyle hall, perhaps, that could be combined with stacked layers of CLT to create a multi kind of story structure. And then we were also thinking, and this is the last project, I promise, about this project, which we completed a few years ago for an early childhood enrichment center in rural Arkansas. The building was predicated on a couple of principles. One was that the children would have immediate and constant access to the out of doors from all of their learning spaces, but also that everything in the building would be low VOC, low toxicity. So there were no plastics, no vinyls, there was no PVC in the building. All the materials were low formaldehyde. However, generally speaking, we used concrete, we used steel. So we're interested in working with this client to develop a rapidly deployable prototype for thinking about how we could construct these kinds of early childhood education centers within rural areas of the country where you had both a surplus of straw, but also a lack of access to childhood education in most of these areas. So we developed this system of combining jumbo circular straw bales into these kind of linked kind of chained arrangements, coating them with a flexible skin of bamboo, and then combining them into a series, in this case, of circular classrooms that could be capped by a sequence of LVL beams in a reciprocal roof shape that could be orchestrated around a central oculus, creating these sort of thickened insulated classrooms that were illuminated from above. The thickness of the columns used for additional storage space and childhood cubby holes, but also extending out into a series of adjacent playscapes. So each two of these circular classrooms would be combined around a modular CLT core, creating these conveniently heart-shaped spaces that would be linked to a series of age-appropriate exterior playscapes. As the jumbo straw bales move from inside to outside, they lose their protective skin and are allowed to biodegrade into the surrounding terrain, creating both a kind of a series of substrate for a series of productive gardens that would act as both a kind of nutritional and educational resource for the students. So just to summarize, in all of these instances and experiments and researches, we're really interested in the ways in which an encounter with these material systems, biogenic material systems, can act as a kind of a catalyst for rethinking a whole series of architectural commonplaces, from questions of standardization and efficiency, maintenance and repair, to notions of durability and entropy. We really feel like we're at a potentially super exciting moment, right? And if one could argue that modernism was ultimately predicated on the emergence of new structural capacities based on the emergent materials of concrete and steel, we feel like we're at a kind of fantastic moment to really begin to test, experiment with, and speculate upon how these plant-based logics of building can actually inform new ways of building, which are not only better for the planet, better for ourselves, but it also can create a kind of more convivial relationship to the planet and to each other. Thank you. That's it.
Well, congratulations first on finishing right on time. It was very precise. Thank you for the amazing lecture. There's so much to digest and very impressive also in terms of the work you showed. But for me also, most impressive was the setup, the argument you made at the beginning, demonstrating the importance of embodied carbon and how we have to address it. But given that call to action at the, to mitigate phenomena at a global scale, right? The magnitude of the problem. And I'm sure this question comes up all the time, and I'm going to be the person who brings it up because I want to give you the opportunity to elaborate on this. And you started to do it at the very end. How do you, because one may say that there's a bit of a disconnect between this discussion of global phenomena and mitigation and the very refined, sophisticated, idiosyncratic houses that your practice does. And the connection is not very obvious. How is this going to help? So can you elaborate on how those experiments actually may translate into mass-produced built environments that may have a big impact on a global scale?
Yeah, no, it's the $1 million question, of course, and the one we're always, I think, both receiving as a question, but also kind of, questioning ourselves the kind of right approaches for this. And I mean, maybe I'll just address it from a couple of different standpoints. The first is, of course, one question would be, well, the house itself, right, which is a kind of a smaller scale element. I think I forgot to articulate this, but one of the reasons that we're interested in houses is precisely, in a sense, their ubiquity, right? That we build houses, again, 1 million a year. There's a huge industry that, generally speaking, architects are not even part of in kind of typical circles, but which also, because it's smaller scale, because it's relatively low tech, actually for us represent a potential point of intervention within kind of material and production systems, right? So in other words, it's maybe hard to reimagine multi-scale, housing in the middle of the city with biogenic materials right now, although it's actually being done in some places. But so one question was, okay, can a smaller scale architectural element, because of its multiplicity and just because of its kind of everywhereness and frequency, have an impact, right? And the idea that the house has historically acted as a mechanism for experimentation, for evolving new modes of building and new ways of thinking about architecture. The other is, I mean, one thing that we're super conscious of is the divide. I mean, we also, there's this potential divide between what we often talk about as a substitution mentality, and then the idea of what we're obviously very interested in, which is the way in which thinking about these materials can actually provoke a response in terms of architectural form, right? And so the most efficient way to do this, right, if we were just interested in what's the most efficient way to get the kind of most effective response, there are many people working now. There is, and this is maybe slightly overly optimistic, but a kind of Cambrian explosion in materials and products that are based on plant, a kind of biogenic and other plant-based materials, ranging from, cellulose-based insulations that are, basically working with timber residue, to various forms of hemp-based products, other forms of manipulating agricultural waste, and of course the kind of proliferation in timber building. And so there's this capacity to say, okay, we build in a certain way now. If we really want to make a super fast impact, we can exchange all of the negative carbon, right, high embodied carbon materials, toxic materials that we utilize with better ones, right? And I think that is obviously super important to do, and an effective strategy, and obviously something we would advocate for. The other thing that we're conscious of, though, is that I think that these ways and forms of building often get a kind of bad rap, particularly within architectural circles, because they're associated with a kind of retrogressive aesthetic, or a kind of nostalgic return to a kind of previous time, right? And I think one of the things that we're interested in doing in the book was therefore to highlight, and not just in our own houses, but in these other houses from around the world, people who are working with it in ways that were just compelling architecturally, because I think it's important, right? If people are, if, you know, all of you guys, if architecture students, architects of the discipline in general, if the general public is going to accept these materials, that there has to be a kind of a level of seduction in a sense, right? To kind of, to sort of argue that not only, you know, we are all kind of, I think people get rapidly exhausted by the, you know, the sort of, kind of ethical responsibility of having to behave well, right? So I think there's an important aspect of what we're trying to bring forward, which is to say, like, this can actually be imaginative and creative and exciting from all of the ways that we tend to think of it as architects. So I think there is a, of course, everything you're saying is absolutely right, but I think there's the other side of it for us is to say, you know, if we just, you know, built in the, if we just show those other examples, which I think other people are doing, then maybe we're missing out on a potential to kind of energize a new generation to really think about these materials in more inventive ways, right?
Yeah, I love that answer. And I think the project too shows the diversity of materials and emphasizes a kind of persistence to disconnect from one type of material and really embrace diverse materials in every project. And so in that vein, I was curious how maybe paying attention to the diversity of materials, the many different ways they are acquired or produced, how that can transform the agency of the architect themselves, not just in relation to practice, but also as a kind of political agent in the political economy, in the world, as a real kind of actor with a certain kind of very special expertise beyond just kind of aesthetics. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think, yeah, one thing that we were also very conscious of in the book, and it came up a number of different times, but is not essentially disincluding projects because they used, you know, some concrete, some steel, right, some industrial process materials that were obviously higher in embodied carbon, because of course then you get into this position where the kind of desire for absolute purity basically kind of eliminates the potential for progress at some level, right? So we were really interested in saying, okay, how do we actually, you know, accept that in some cases we're not going to escape using concrete for foundations, but maybe that's okay because we can offset that through the utilization of other materials, and as we progress on rethinking concrete in different ways, right? And making it lower carbon in the future, then, you know, we're not likely, right? It's probably a fantasy that we're going to eliminate the use of concrete globally, right? It's just too ubiquitous, right? It's too dominant. And so I think one aspect of it is really that, which is trying to say, in order to argue for the acceptance of these materials and their incorporation, if we wait for the absolute perfect, then we're never going to get there, essentially, right? So how do we actually think about the different capacities of systems and materials to do different things, right? Like hemp is a good insulator, but it's not a great structure, right? Certain materials like cork are great for a lot of things, but there isn't a lot of it in the world, and therefore, right, there's a kind of cost implication and also just an ecosystemic impact from that. So looking at kind of the sort of differential kind of variable benefits that one gets from any given material, and then thinking about those in terms of their combinations or exchanges with other materials and how you can get, in a sense, a kind of a greater benefit from maybe the admixture and kind of commingling of different strategies rather than trying to kind of deploy a singular one. Yeah.
Funny when you mentioned the materials, diversity of materials, I was thinking, oh, this is such an interesting discussion in the context of this school, because I don't know if you are aware of this, but this school has a reputation for the privileging the drawing as a site of the architectural imagination. So I was immediately thinking about how can one recover materiality in representational strategies. But then I was also reminded that LTL also has that reputation for innovation in representation, that of course the section drawings, etc. So is that part of the thinking here, how to invent new modes of representation to get at those issues in your practice?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And I don't feel that we've arrived at a perfect answer to that question, but I think that is part of the challenge, right? When we were in the first manual section publication, we were essentially drawing buildings that were more iconic in many cases, that were kind of operating according to more, let's say, kind of typical contemporary materialities and kind of formal strategies. So drawing those buildings kind of fit more easily into the kind of palette of representational techniques, right, that architects typically deploy. When we're dealing with the biogenic materials, which have, irregularities, kind of non-standard modularities, kind of differences, right? Even like each bamboo culm is slightly different, right, from the next. We're suddenly in a realm where a lot of the ways that we typically think about architectural, not only materiality, but also its representation, I think come into question, right? And so, one draws a wall, one assumes a straight line, but in these instances, right, you can't necessarily assume that perfect straight line. And a lot of the ways in which, the kind of replication and the kind of efficiencies that come from that, right, start to shift in interesting ways. And I think that one, and it's funny when I did this lecture at Columbia that our dean kind of asked a similar question. And I think he was pushing on this idea that in the manual biogenic house sections, we're in a way using the more conventional paradigms of sectional drawing to draw these more unconventional buildings, which I think is true, right? I think that is maybe a first step because it starts to reveal certain kind of potentials and possibilities. But I think a next range would be now how does one find new modes, right? How do you involve new modes of representation that also kind of engage with the kind of specific material kind of qualities of these kind of plant-based elements? And I think even questions of like temporality come into play, right? That normally we think about buildings again as something that comes into being. Modernist buildings are meant to look that way forever, right? They don't, because all buildings change and age over time, as we know. But that's even more so true of, a material of an earthen building, for example, which is going to transform over time. It's going to erode in different ways and maybe be rebuilt or maintained, and that's going to change the building over time. So thinking about and this is not so present in the book, except maybe in some of the diagrams of kind of material processing and the life cycle diagrams, but thinking about the building not as, a static thing that exists in a kind of forever state, but as something that's going to evolve and change and transform over time.
Yeah, and moving away from the sort of dominant image, the hyper realistic representation opens up opportunities for kind of more creative engagement with the drawing process, but also a kind of personal take on, materiality. My question was related to whether there was a material you did not include, you were not able to include into the manual, or and if there was a material that you discovered later on as you kind of got into this research with your own firm that you would have included or you will include in a new edition, maybe, another Turkish edition, the missing Turkish edition.
Yeah, and it's also a good question. I think one thing that did happen is I think as we continue to do the research on the book, and this is really just the last 5, 6, 7 years or so, we became increasingly aware, right, that it was sort of co-evolving with the emergence of a lot of researches that are working along similar trajectories. And we have a lot of colleagues, Lola Benalan at Columbia, who runs the Natural Materials Lab, who does a lot of experiments with geogenic materials, and David Benjamin, who teaches there as well, who's also become very interested in straw and other agricultural residues. Mei-Ling Locko at Yale, who's working with agricultural waste from other parts of the world and its kind of relationship to material processes in those locations. So I think there's a lot of work that's informed our work to begin with. I do think one thing that our perception that has somewhat changed over time, and again, this is, I don't want to make a kind of blanket value judgment about it because obviously there's enormous benefits, but just realizing increasingly the kind of complexities involved with mass timber, and the ways in which, although, broadly speaking, it has enormous capacity to kind of replace a lot of conventional material systems, like, it's very easily integrated into kind of kind of as a replacement for sort of post and beam concrete type construction. When you're actually starting to look at the complexities of mass timber in relationship to management of forests, in relationship to the kind of large scale kind of logging practices and the manufacturing, the fact that most of our mass timber still is not produced in this country, things of that nature, right? The kind of idea of it as a kind of universal ideal product, I think I think is open to question, right, and investigation, which again is not to say dismissing it, but really to sort of say to interrogate it further. In terms of materials that we by the way, didn't talk about all the materials tonight. Like we do also have stone and earth in the book, which are the geogenic component. But since this was vegetal life, I kind of focused on the more plant-based ones. We're super interested in hemp, but we're also, I think there are limits to hemp in terms of the way it's used in buildings. One of the things that kind of we're a bit stymied about in a lot of these cases, and it's true of straw, which we're obviously very fascinated with, is the fact that frequently when you build these materials, they end up being concealed and somewhat invisible within the context of the finished architecture. And there's maybe certain part of us which is still of the sort of the strain of wanting the building to be an expression of its material logics, but being able to actually visually identify that. And so I think one of the things, I wouldn't say it's maybe a material that we want to have included necessarily, but I think the more we engage with these materials, I think the more we're really interested in seeing how they can, the ones that are most interesting to us are the ones that have the highest degree of kind of architectural effect, in a sense, right?
So when you mentioned the walls that are not straight and the temporality, building changing over time, I was wondering if you ever experimented with the biogenic materials that are not in their inert state, or they are still living and growing and changing, and how do they can generate a different kind of architecture?
Yeah, we haven't yet. I think it's a really exciting potentiality. I mean, I think one thing we kind of explore a little bit in the drawings is this idea of kind of degeneration, right, or decay of the material, which then can sponsor growth. So the idea that part of the building, if you're building with plants, it can harmlessly degrade into the surrounding environment, provide a substrate for other plant life or a habitat for animals, for example. But it is interesting because generally speaking, right, these are still cultivated materials, right? And even mycelium, which isn't really in the book, but obviously people are very interested in, right? You grow it and then you essentially bake it, right, to kill it to produce the building product, right? And so I think that's a frontier that is I think something that we're really interested in beginning to kind of speculate about further. And I think, but I think yeah, it's a great question, one we haven't fully explored yet. Yeah.
Buildings that are baked.
Yeah, exactly.
Cooked. Do we have time, or should we open up to the students maybe? What do you think? Okay, yeah. Any questions from the audience? Yeah, I can also walk around.
I can also talk about.
Yeah. All right. Yeah.
All right. Yeah. I just have a question about the scalability of like straw in an urban context. I see how it can be used. I see how it's used. I see how it's assembled. I think it's great. But do you think we can figure out a way to scale it up to resist like the structural concerns of like a skyscraper? Because when you were talking, you were saying that it gets squishy under high compression forces. And so like maybe you need like some materials that are malleable enough to adapt to that. I don't know if you've researched that at all.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's a part of this whole question about scalability. I think when we're thinking about straw, there are multi-story housing projects. A lot of them are in places like France and Belgium that are using straw. They're using it principally in combination frequently with mass timber and primarily as a kind of insulation material because of its kind of insulative and carbon sequestering capacity. So I think once you get above a certain height in structure, it's not that straw becomes inapplicable, but the nature of its application changes, right? So it starts to shift from being a structural material to being really primarily a kind of a thermal material. Because there obviously are limits. You're not going to build a 100-story skyscraper out of straw ultimately, unfortunately. That would be cool. But I think testing those limits, I think, is still to be done. And there are, I think, a lot of ways in which we can continue to work with the material to maximize the structural capacity. So I alluded to it quickly here, but these compressed straw products that are emerging that are based on thermally binding the straw to itself achieve a much higher level of compression than, for example, we were doing with our like jury-rigged contraption, or that a conventional straw baler, an agricultural baler does, right? Because those are really only getting up to a certain level because they were never intended, right, to be necessarily utilized as building products. That became a kind of a secondary appropriated use, right? But these more compressed products do increase the structural capacity. There's also the ability to kind of add materials to the mixture to increase that even further. And I think one of the things that I think, if we think about the last 100 years or so, right, there's been enormous amount of research, thinking, experimentation, material advancement done on materials like concrete and steel to refine them, to increase their capacities. And so, that simply hasn't happened, right, with a lot of these vegetal strategies. But it could, right? So I think one of the things that I think is starting to happen, and I think hopefully we'll continue to see emerge over the course of the next several years or decades, is really that a lot of the performance that we're getting out of these materials now, which are really based in large degree on using them in a nearly raw form, will be enhanced by just the kind of sort of intelligent application of technical processing onto the materials. Now, there's going to be a limit to that because, as I was mentioning before, the more we process it, then we start to potentially lose some of the benefits from an embodied carbon perspective, because each of those levels of processing obviously involve energy, right? And sometimes heat and things like that, right? So, but I do think that there's untapped potential. There will be limits inevitably, as there are with all materials in terms of what it can do. But I don't think we've seen the sort of optimized version of it by any means at this point.
Okay. You might have already touched on this, but I kind of have two questions. So, do you believe these materials have the opportunity to find themselves in the existing buildings or housing stock already? Because you were saying we're going to be building a lot more in the future, but the houses that are here right now, how do we stop them from being deconstructed into something completely new? And also, just how do we make these more accessible to people and make them more accepted widely?
Yeah, no, good questions. I think it's a really good point about reutilization of existing housing stock. We have so much underperforming, right, housing in the country. That's also happens to be in kind of, various states of kind of degradation and poor repair. I was recently at a conference in upstate New York, and there was a woman there who headed an organization that basically provided energy retrofits for underserved communities. So they were looking at basically how do they replace people's, gas boilers with more efficient things like heat pumps and other systems. And she said, when we sort of dug a little further into it, that one of the challenges was that although they were set up to replace the mechanical systems within these houses, the houses were in such terrible repair and so poorly insulated and thermally leaky that replacing the energy systems became almost irrelevant, right? That the real question became repairing the houses and actually making them perform at that basic level. So I think there are enormous opportunities for actually thinking about how do we renovate buildings. We're actually working right now on a building at a small campus in upstate New York, and basically proposing the reuse of an existing building by insulating it externally with straw. And there are also certain challenges with that because of exactly the things I was talking about how we build houses, right? So we build houses using certain systems that are meant to control things like vapor penetrability and moisture infiltration into houses. And so you can't, in all instances, just put an additional layer of straw on the outside of an existing building without creating unintended consequences in terms of the performance of the interior walls within that, based on how moisture flows and how temperature changes, and obviously based on kind of climatic situations. So yes, absolutely, but it's a little tricky, right? And you really have to get into the kind of building science of it to really understand how the kind of insulative capacity can be maximized without creating other issues or problems within the construction of those existing buildings. In terms of kind of how do we kind of bring it into broader use, again, now I will use mass timber as an example, right? 15, 20 years ago, we weren't building, 8-story buildings out of mass timber, and now it's kind of widely accepted. And there's been a kind of a general process of integrating these materials into building codes and into constructional practices. And it's a process, right? And it's a kind of political process. It's a regulatory process. And I think architects absolutely need to be involved on that end of things, to be advocating for the inclusion of these materials within the kind of, in a way, kind of structures, right? And kind of legislative logics that within which we practice, right? Because as architects, we're always bound by those things. Straw bale building is actually part of the IBC. It's a kind of part of the residential IBC now, for example. It's part of California building code. So I think, yeah, it's a process of these things being increasingly incorporated. And then in terms of acceptance by the public, I think it gets to some of these other tricky questions that we talked about, which is working against people's normative perceptions of these materials. So for example, the idea that straw burns, right? Which usually comes up, hasn't come up yet tonight, but I didn't include the slide, but I usually put a slide up that shows a flame test on a compressed straw wall versus a wall insulated with EPS, extruded polystyrene, which is commonly used in buildings and accepted in many building codes. And the straw doesn't burn. Compressed straw basically chars. And on a thick, let's say a 12-inch thick straw bale wall, you can put a flamethrower on one side, and the level of change on the other side is minimal after a fairly, like several minutes. You put a torch to EPS, it not only ignites, but it actually starts burning hotter than the source torch. Within seconds, it releases toxic material, off gases. I mean, it's like, it's a petroleum product, right? It's gonna burn. So we put things in our buildings all the time that are incredibly bad for us and which are also extraordinarily dangerous, right? Grenfell Tower tragedy is a sad example of this, for example. And, people don't question that, but suddenly straw, we assume it's somehow going to be problematic in that way, which is not necessarily the case if it's treated properly, right? Of course, if you put a pile of straw on the floor and throw a match on it, it will burn, but in its kind of the form that it's utilized in building construction, that's not the case, right? So I think it's also education, right? It's also kind of bringing people along and understanding what the capacities of these materials are and what their benefits are, but also understanding the obverse, which is that right now you're living with an enormous quantity of toxic materials in your house that are, have proven health effects from endocrine disruption to kind of cancer induction, right? So it's not just what these things can do that are good, but everything else that we've been doing for the last 100 years that isn't so great, right? Yeah.
Also, in terms of that second question, which I think is important, and I really think this is where you are most effective, is in demonstrating that building with these materials can be very compelling. I mean, we're not talking about frugal, austere houses. They're generous, they're beautiful, they're super cool. I think this is very important, and it counts. That kind of architectural advocacy through excellence in design is what accounts, I think, for the success of mass timber, because we have seen so many interesting buildings using that material, including from our esteemed colleagues here.
Thank you.
Sort of a follow-on to her question about scaling and your answer about scaling and regulations and costs and really policy, which may not involve regulations, but actually making cement more expensive to produce. Companies like Holcim, one of the biggest in the world cement producers, has come out and specifically said that they would back that kind of a policy to put a price on that. And I'm going to let you present the answer to those in the room on how that would help scale the alternative and maybe change people's perceptions about specifying this instead of that. If you could say something about that.
Yeah, it's a really good question. Well, you're the expert actually on cement and concrete, right? Yeah, I think there are a number of things embedded in that question. One is just, concrete is so ubiquitous, right? And there's challenges in building with it, or changing people's desire to build with it. For example, in parts of the world like, so-called lesser developed places in the world where we've been so, and I think this is part of what your research involves, right? We've been so successful in exporting the idea of concrete as the kind of preeminent kind of emblem of modernity, right? As progress, as like, this is how you build, right? By the way, just as an aside, I love concrete. Is that like, I love concrete buildings. I always have. So it's really hard for me to sort of say these sorts of things. But we know, right, what the effects are, right? So yeah, I think what the reality of that is, I'm not an expert in saying, but I do think that it is true that in terms of the people who build, right, in terms of motivating clients to build in new ways is difficult. And in some cases, yeah, I think the idea that, ultimately, usually when we face an issue, we completed a dorm at Carnegie Mellon recently, and our proposal was to build it out of mass timber. We were ultimately unsuccessful in getting that done, and the arguments were economic, right? So it's always the sort of, the sort of hard bottom line question that comes into play that often becomes the reason that these are canceled out, even when in fact you could make the argument that it actually wasn't more expensive. But so I think that's part of it. The other thing, and I'd be, this is again something we haven't actively researched, but I do know that there are many different ways in which the ways in which we make concrete. Obviously, the problematic part of concrete is the cement, it's Portland cement, right, and the production of Portland cement. Many different methodologies are now being researched to reduce the carbon that's in concrete, both in terms of replacing cement with other additives, kind of supplementary materials, et cetera, but just other ways of making concrete, right? And again, no doubt you know more about this than I do. I think that's also incredibly important because I think I think we can, I think policy and legislation and different incentives or disincentives for building with materials is incredibly important because ultimately that's what's going to impact clients who are building these things. But I also think from a material science perspective, there are certain things biogenic materials can't do, right? They can't make a window, for example, very easily, right? We can't replace glass so readily with it. It's hard to make a retaining wall or a foundation system Although many of the buildings that I showed sometimes use screw piles as foundations, which minimize the amount of concrete. But ultimately, right, we're going to need these materials in some way, shape, or form if we're going to continue building. How do we also make them better, right?
Thank you for coming here. And as Corey said, you're not just doing the research and sharing the research, you're also leading by example. So thank you for that. I have maybe a potentially boring question because it's about carbon accounting. I remember one of the graphs that you had at the beginning of the kind of sliding scale of embodied carbon. And when it comes to carbon accounting, a lot of times architects, I guess, run the equivalent of a cash only business when they use glue so heavily. And I just wonder, in looking at that graphic, I noticed that it was either LSL, LVL, CLT, OSB, one of these that is essentially wood fiber and glue. So how could something like that have a higher carbon uptake if it's using those glues or resins or something like that?
Yeah, well, I think you're right that the glues and resins and additives in those products are part of the issue with them, right? And there are of course things like DLT, right, and CDLT, basically like dowel laminated timbers that eliminate the adhesive component. There are also people looking at like organic, like soy-based adhesives, for example, for making CLT panels. So there are ways of kind of reducing those impacts. I think it's a difference. The carbon accounting thing is a really tricky thing, and I am absolutely not an expert in that. Many people in our office were working on that part of the book, and we were originally going to do a carbon calculation for every project in the book and then realized that that was a fool's errand. We were never going to be able to do it, but also that it's extraordinarily difficult to get a kind of apples to apples comparison, particularly among projects that are built in many different places in the world, because there are there's not a single standard for a lot of these material values. The ones that exist, that are based on like EPDs and things like that, they're are really based on building products. So in terms of getting a value for like a stalk of bamboo, right, or a bale of straw, it's more variable. Where things are produced makes a difference, right? Because even like the energy source that runs the factory, whether it's renewable or fossil fuel based, is going to have an impact on the carb. So like all of these sort of subtleties of everything from transportation to kind of site of manufacture kind of play a role in that, right? So we kind of I don't want to say we gave up on calculating all of them. We did calculate some. And it was, for us, it really became a question of not the kind of precise numerical quantification, but just a kind of comparative understanding of things, right? The kind of, this is obviously better than that, rather than, tying our, tying it to like, this is exactly accurate, because it's so difficult, right? And as you know, there are different calculators and different methodologies and things emerging, and maybe gradually those will become increasingly standardized and precise. But I think it's very complex. I think the glue versus carbon equation are kind of like, it's sort of two slightly different things, but I think it's a super good point, because I think we raise this in the book, and it kind of falls outside of the scope of the question of carbon per se, but it's really this whole question of the other effects of the kinds of industrially processed materials that we're using, right? And all of the chemical additives, all of the kind of embedded toxicity, the impacts on human health, on the workers who manufacture it, right? The people who install it, and then all of us who live in it. That goes beyond the carbon question, right? It goes to all of these other kind of materials that are kind of embedded in those highly processed materials without us necessarily even thinking about it or knowing about it most of the time. Most paints are microplastics, right? And as we know, right, microplastics are now ubiquitous, not only in the landscape, but in our bodies, right? What was the latest crazy thing I read? That the amount of microplastic in the average human brain now equates to a plastic spoon, right? So like it's like all around us at this point. And that's why, there's not only I think the carbon is a huge part of the argument, but the other parts of that have to do with just not building with things that are, incredibly dangerous to our health is another part of it. Right?
Thank you.
Thank you.